Hi, I'm Lawrence Krauss, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. Today's podcast is unique in our experience for a variety of reasons. My guest, Heather McDonald, is a very provocative and interesting journalist, and we originally had a conversation in her apartment in New York City almost 2 years ago. And the issues she was discussing at the time, based on her book called The Diversity Delusion at that time, were provocative as they are provocative today, but at the time may have seemed outrageous to many people, and they still may to some people. But what's been interesting is in the last 2 years, the public conversation has shifted with the development, the popularization of critical race theory and discussions of wokeness and in popular literature and mainstream magazines. Some of the issues she raised then are a little more common and may seem a little less outrageous, though I suspect they'll still provoke and disturb some people, but that's okay. But because that was recorded a while ago, what we decided to do was do a second discussion more recently by Zoom where we could update some of those issues. So this is a two-pronged interview spanning almost 2 years, one in person recorded in 3 cameras and the other by Zoom. And I hope you'll find both discussions interesting and the updates particularly interesting. Heather doesn't mince words, and she and I don't agree on everything, as you'll see. But I think it's very important to have these conversations with people, even if you don't agree with them, especially, in fact, if you don't agree with them. And so this is another example of the kind of dialogue that I think should be happening. Plus, I think several of the issues she raises are very important and need to be discussed in public. So I hope you enjoy the upcoming interview and or discussion. They're not interviews, they're discussions. But let me also say that for our viewers on YouTube, about 85% of our viewers are not subscribed to our channel. It'd be great if you could subscribe to our channel. And if you want more content and want access to things like live Q&As with me, please consider subscribing to our Patreon subscription service, where you can watch these things, in fact, without any additional advertisements as well. But we also have live Q&As and other things, and it helps support this podcast, which is part of a nonprofit organization, the Origins Project Foundation. So please consider either subscribing to YouTube or subscribing to Patreon. And if you're a Patreon member, you can write in about issues you want to discuss, people you'd like me to interview, or dialogues we'd like to have, and make it a little more interactive. And we're hoping to try and make this more interactive all the time. Having said all that, I hope you enjoy the upcoming podcast here with Heather McDonald. Well, Heather McDonald, thank you for letting us invade your personal space here.
Well, it's been interesting watching the setup. It's an impressive crew you've got here.
They are. They're always behind the scenes, but they're impressive behind the scenes.
I look like a Hollywood studio here.
It's right. It's actually all fake. It's just a backdrop. But here we are, and I want to first. This is going to be a fun conversation for so many reasons, in my opinion. But we come from opposite sides of the political aisle, and in principle.
Don't be so certain.
Well, yeah. We'll see, and that's great. I think this is an example of actually talking to people you don't always agree with about everything. It's a new concept, and I applaud you for, in your writing, which I've been a big fan of, for sort of confronting what you might call much conventional political wisdom, and you do it with actually facts, which is really refreshing, as well as cogent arguments. And so, although, as I say, I don't agree with all of them, but I really applaud your lucid and courageous efforts.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you then keeping an open mind if we do come from polar opposites, which we'll discover. I didn't realize that, so now I'm going to be on my guard here.
I'm a left-wing.
Traditionally, an academic, of course.
Yeah, of course, exactly. We all are. And I should also, in the spirit of the current times, give a trigger warning to the people watching and listening that we're going to talk about difficult concepts for some people to hear, and they shouldn't be, but they are, and we're going to push people's buttons, and that's a good thing, in my opinion. And if you don't like having your buttons pushed, it's time to push the button and listen to something else right now.
It's just remarkable that you have to give that, though. I frankly do not believe that. I don't take it seriously that people are truly emotionally traumatized by hearing a discussion of something they disagree with. I frankly think it's fakery. It's a way of shutting out, trying to shut down ideas you disagree with. But the idea that people actually feel emotionally affected by a perfectly rational discussion, to me is preposterous. But maybe I am completely out of touch.
Well, I think we find that what people believe they feel makes them feel a certain way, and if people have been convinced that they should feel that way, we'll get to that actually, because I mean, much of the points you're trying to raise, many of the points you're trying to raise are just about this. So, but first, this is the Origins podcast, so I want to talk a little bit about your origins, how you came to the point to be escorted by police off a campus, or at least protected by police from students. So let's talk about your background a little bit. How did you? What was your interest in, and why? Ultimately, what I really want to focus on is your recent book, which I think is a masterpiece, called The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. But how did you get there?
I don't know if you want to know politically or intellectually.
Both.
I began as a default liberal on the West Coast, which is what one is. I have to say, and I don't really mean, this sounds condescending, but it's what the air one breathes, and so you have to work your way out of that position if one is going to do so. I loved school. I loved studying. I loved reading literature. And I was fascinated by language. And in high school, I adored Faulkner. I adored Moby Dick. I adored language that was pushing the envelope, was trying to create something wild and new. So when I went to college, I was a prime sort of target for this mad literary theory that was reigning at Yale, which is where I went to undergraduate at the time in the 70s, and it embraced a set of propositions that I now look upon as obviously, empirically wrong. Things like language always breaks down. There is no possibility of a successful communication. Every book is about its own failure. Literature is not, you may think it's about trying to describe the agony of a first love or the vicious social gossip in a tiny 19th century town. No, that's not. Wrong. Paul de Man would tell you it's about its own inability to mean. And the most absurd claim was that the human self is nothing more than a trope of language. There is no self. We are simply a play of linguistic science. I bought into this.
Which, by the way, for people who weren't subjected to that nonsense, was called deconstructionism.
Deconstruction, post-structuralism, right.
Yeah.
So I was uncritical. It felt like the hottest thing going. Yale had this feeling of being at the cutting edge intellectually, and this was a secret knowledge. It was a secret society that allowed you to feel superior to those unwashed who actually thought that you could read a book and understand the author's intent, or that you could make a contract and it would actually work to bind the parties. So I got sucked into this. I wasted far too much time in the sterling stacks of Yale's main library, slogging through Jacques Derrida's La Mythologie Blanche, because I suspended disbelief, and I revered my professors. They seemed the source of knowledge. And so that I wasted far too much time reading theory instead of great books, which I did, fortunately, at the time, still read some extraordinary literature. And in fact, the one benefit of being in the college in the 70s as opposed to the 80s was one still got to read the canon. I got to read dead white males without anybody thinking to bitch and moan about their gonads and melanin. It never occurred to me, as I was struggling with Milton's syntax in Paradise Lost, that what I really should be upset about, besides his Latinate diction, was that he's a male and, he's writing from some patriarchal tradition. And yes, in fact, Eve is shown as submissive to Adam. So what? The fact of the matter is the language was erotically rich. It was unbelievable. It was bursting with gorgeousness of the fruits in Eden. And so deconstruction still read great literature from a perverse perspective.
But trying to deconstruct it.
Trying to deconstruct it, but it had very good taste when it came to literature. So I then studied in England, and I studied linguistics, which was a complete revelation to me. And I loved phonetics. We were talking before about Chomsky. I liked syntax. But what I really loved was speech act theory. J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words, and John Searle, who's a philosopher at Berkeley. And Austin has this wonderful he was a British philosopher in the analytic tradition, and he has this marvelous dry language. But what he noticed is that analytic philosophy up to then had been interested with what it called the truth conditions of language. What are the conditions under which a sentence is true? And Austin noticed there's a whole category of language for which the criteria of truth and falsity don't apply. Things like, I hereby take you as my duly wedded husband. That's not true or false. It can backfire. It can be a successful statement or an unsuccessful, but it is not describing something in the world. It is actually changing the world. And, I christened this ship, HMS Pinafore. Again, if you don't have a ship or you don't have the capacity to christen it, and nobody, you're sitting there breaking your champagne bottle and you're just walking by, you have not christened the ship. But under certain conditions, that speech act will change the world. And so Austin set out to think about those conditions in the way he called them illocutionary utterances can work or misfire. So that to me was a sense of language as something dynamic. I came back to Yale to start a PhD, and
in literature or
in comparative literature, which is where deconstruction was at its hottest.
Yeah.
And I sat in on Paul de Man's class. He was the most sort of austere and daunting and magisterial of the Yale deconstructionists, whereas Jeffrey Hartman was sort of elfin and playful. And I heard him engaging in the same rhetoric, this weird, bizarre rhetoric obsessed with decapitation and mutilation in Shelley, for God's sakes. And I thought, this is madness. This is madness. And these people are saying the same thing as when I left. It's a broken record, and it has nothing to do with language. It is not interesting. It is a rhetoric that is self-referential. It's a bunch of effete rhetorical gestures. This arcane language, and we all know it. It's because it's spread. These diacritical marks, so you'd have the, impressions, disimpressions with the slash, and everybody started picking that up. So I thought, this is madness, but it was sort of a crisis for me because I had revered these people, but I quit. But I still had the theory bug in me, so I had intuited that legal studies had a lot of the same questions of hermeneutics, which is the question of interpreting texts. How do you interpret a text?
Yeah, sure, for the legal profession.
So I went to law school, not because I want to be a lawyer, but I was interested in critical legal studies, which was the legal version of deconstruction. I still had the theory bug in me. And it was absurd. I tried writing a law school note on Article 3 of the Uniform Commercial Code applying speech act theory. Article 3 deals with promissory notes, negotiable instruments. This was insane. I was so clueless. These are very practical commercial piece of paper to deal with credit in the evolving economy. To apply speech act theory is so dumb to that, but I couldn't see it. I was still blinded by theory that this is something that works. It's something that is in commerce. I kept yearning to go back to academia because, to me, again, the greatest privilege in the world is to be a curator of this tradition, of these books that we should all be down on our knees in gratitude before. None of us deserve them. And if we don't read them, they die. And they bring to us language, experience, feeling that we would otherwise not have access to. So I kept wanting to go back, but every time I looked at academia, it was getting dumber and dumber, and multiculturalism hit. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, you had this shallow narcissism of students who don't know anything, thinking that they are justified in rejecting works of such profound sublimity simply because of the gonads and melanin of the people who wrote them. This was shocking to me. So I didn't start a PhD up again, and my goal at that point was to write the definitive refutation of deconstruction, because I was so mad because I'd wasted so much time. Instead of reading more Trollope, instead of reading more Jonathan Swift, I read Derrida and Saussure, who's a dead end.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I taught at Yale a little bit after that time, and I was on Science Hill, which we sort of looked down on that thing. But the interesting thing is most of the Steele students never walked up the hill, the science part. They spent down and deconstructing down at the other end.
Yeah, no, it was, and if I were a scientist or a science student, a STEM student, I'd be pretty mad, that you still have standards there, and the students are working.
There was definitely a different sense, and up on Science Hill, but
yet the theorists, the literary theorists, thought they knew more than you guys did. Because eventually, even we had the great Alan Sokol hoax. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The physicist who wrote this work purporting to show that all sorts of theories in physics are merely tropes. They're merely linguistic tropes.
In fact, the first time I ever heard the word hermeneutics was, I think, in Alan Sokol's the title of his piece. Which had to do with hermeneutics and string theory.
Yeah. So they're actually the literary theorists are claiming, oh, you guys, you're just victimized by the linguistic tropes. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, so just to condense, so I started writing short pieces on what was happening in culture at that point, multiculturalism, postmodernism, and I eventually started doing real journalism, which I'd never done in college, which I regret. And that's what really turned me, I guess, a little more conservative, was going out, and this was in the 90s in New York with Rudolph Giuliani, the mayor, and big things were happening then.
Yes.
He was trying to change the welfare culture of the city. We had 1 in every 7 people in welfare in the country were in New York. He was also bringing crime down to record lows. So I started going to homeless shelters and welfare offices because I figure I don't know anything. My only value added as a writer is I'm willing to go out and go into strange neighborhoods and talk to people, and I find people like talking. And so I would go to welfare offices, and the clients would tell me they should have done this welfare reform years ago. These welfare mothers, and again, this is a welfare mother speaking. This is not Ronald Reagan with his welfare queen conceit. These welfare mothers are having more babies just to get their welfare check increased. These are the welfare mothers speaking again. Or they're too lazy to even change the 40-watt bulb in their apartment. I talked to this one couple where the guy was absolutely entitled about, they're not going to make me work. If getting food stamps, he's an able-bodied, hulking guy. If they make me work, I'm not going to do it. And he mooches off of his girlfriend, who is covered by what used to be called AFDC. So to get her benefits, she had to do a little bit of workfare each week. So he was happy to mooch off of her, but he felt an entitlement, that he had his entitlement to food stamps. So that sort of thing, it started to change me.
It scarred you, clearly. Yes. It traumatized you.
Right.
And started you on the conservative track. But although I've read you describe yourself as a secular conservative, which is an interesting. Nowadays, you have to say that, I guess, in this climate, because there's such a connection between conservatism and religious right, at least in this country.
I didn't realize that. I mean, I'd never read a conservative publication in my life until the 90s. I had no knowledge of this, but it wasn't until the 2000s when I discovered how deeply connected religion was to it.
Well, we could talk about welfare, we could talk about religion, but we're going to go back and talk about what sort of started you on on this was well, it's interesting that deconstructionism started you on the concern about what was happening in academia. And it's interesting that your introduction of yourself, it's a perfect introduction to the book, because on the very first page, you refer to an incident, and I'll read it. It says, in 2016, a student petition at Yale University called for the dismantling of the college's decades-long requirement that English majors take a course covering Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, and Wordsworth. Reading these authors, quote, creates a culture that is especially hostile to students of color. You want comment?
I mean, that encapsulates everything. The delusion. I mean, it really is a delusion that reading a work of great literature creates a climate of hostility. I mean, one doesn't even know how to unpack that.
Yeah, you gave a bunch of examples at the beginning, and we'll go through, but there's another example, of course, and I know the people involved in this case, but Brett Weinstein, but another example of the extremism, quote unquote, I guess that you would describe going on American campuses. In May 2017, students from Evergreen State College in Washington State stormed into a class taught by biology professor Brett Weinstein and began cursing and hurling racial epithets. "Fuck you, you piece of shit," screamed one student. "Get the fuck out of here," screamed another. Weinstein, a lifelong progressive, had refused to obey an edict from Evergreen's director of First Peoples Multicultural Advising Services that all white faculty cancel their courses for a day and stay off campus. And it resulted in that. So I think those kind of examples certainly, from an objective sense, suggest some problems. But you were actually you experienced this directly, and if you could talk about what happened to you at Claremont McKenna College, it would be useful.
Well, my previous book was called The War on Cops, and it was looking at the empirical basis for the Black Lives Matter narrative that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black men, and if you look at the data, it's just not borne out. What determines police use of force is civilian use of force and violence. And recently, a National Academy of Science study came out with this yet again, that it is the civilians' use of violent force that predicts whether an officer will. And so when you look at the data, it turns out that black men are not being shot disproportionately to their involvement in violent street crime. If you use that as a benchmark, sounds uncomfortable to say, but they're actually shot less than would be predicted by their violent engagement in drive-by shootings. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Lawrence, and this is also very painful to say, that the face of violent street crime, and I'm talking here overwhelmingly of robberies, armed robberies, and drive-by shootings in this country is basically black and brown. In New York City, blacks are about 23% of the population. They commit almost 3/4 of all shootings. When you add Hispanic shootings to black shootings, you get over 98% of all shootings in the city. Whites are 34% of the population. They commit less than 2% of all shootings. Those disparities exist in every single city today.
And just so we get a little less hate mail, maybe then.
So my point was, I was just going to push back, and
no, but I want to suggest. I assume you.
I'm not justifying police shootings.
No, exactly. Nor are you suggesting that this is not. There aren't perhaps social conditions that contribute to this. I say.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I would definitely. I would definitely say that there are social conditions that can.
Yeah.
For me,
Anyways.
it's the breakdown of the family and the lack of kids are not being socialized.
Sure.
But in any case, what I found in going out to inner city neighborhoods is that there's an enormous untapped support for the police that does not get reported. I spent a lot of times going to police community meetings in East Harlem, in the South Bronx, in Central Brooklyn, in South Side of Chicago. Every single time, I swear, every single time, what I've heard from those good, law-abiding residents who show up, they take time off of their week to show up at these meetings is, we want more cops, you arrest the dealers, they're back on the corner the next day, why can't you get them off the street? There's kids hanging out by the hundreds fighting. whatever happened to truancy laws, whatever happened to loitering laws. So that was a voice that was not being heard. So I wrote this book saying it's more complicated. It's not, you cannot explain this by police racism. So I was invited to Claremont McKenna College, which is a small liberal arts college in Southern California. And a call went out on Facebook several days before I arrived to shut the fascist McDonald down. And so this got more and more organized, and the students surrounded the auditorium where I was supposed to speak and would not let anybody in. There was some video online of a biology professor, an older man, trying to get in and just getting pushed back by the people. And there were, scuffles and skirmishes. It's nothing like Milo riots in Berkeley, but so nobody could get in. They had to escort me into the auditorium early through all sorts of secret passages. And so I gave my talk to an empty hall, but outside the protesters were chanting and pounding on the plate glass windows. And they had said they'd moved where the podium was because they didn't want the podium to be visible as the night came on and the lights came on in the room, just for safety reasons. And then the pounding on the windows got so bad that they figured they couldn't protect my safety, so I was escorted out the kitchen by the police.
Well, it's one example.
Let me just say, I'm not playing a victim here. And whenever I'm asked to describe what happens, inevitably the left says, "Oh, well, you're playing the victim card like anybody else." I'm not. I'm not claiming I'm a victim.
You're just saying no, but that the fact that could happen on university campus is itself ridiculous.
How is it possible to describe something without, if you're going to say that's a victim? So tell me, tell me.
You sleep at night, though. You can still sleep at night.
Yes, but you tell me how I'm supposed to how anybody's supposed to describe that if that's inaudiment.
Well,
so
anyway, I think facts are facts, and you describe the facts.
The people who are if there were any victims, and I hate the word, if there are any victims, it would be the students who actually had wanted to come and engage with me and ask me questions. That was not possible. So.
No, I think that's the case. I know of it. I attended a similar event that my wife actually knew about, and actually my wife attended the worst part of it at a university up in Oregon, and it was just amazing because it was a law class, in fact, but the kids weren't allowed to hear the kids who'd come weren't allowed to hear because people were playing music and trumping and it's you're doing a disservice to the people who actually want to listen. Well, maybe we'll get to that, but I mean, I've interviewed Ricky Gervais, who points out that people who go to one of these things and get mad at what someone's saying, it's like people who walk down into a street and see a sign saying guitar lessons and saying, "Damn it, I don't want guitar lessons." But anyway, but you point out, I think, as interestingly enough, ironically, you say, of all chance, how do you spell racist? CMC was the most absurd, and it didn't even rhyme. Racist CMC, quote unquote, is so eager for, quote unquote, diverse students that it has historically admitted Black and Hispanic students with an average of 200-point lower SAT score than white and Asian students. So I think that, I mean, part of the point of the initial aspect of your book is that not only is the attempt to silence not just people you disagree with, but Chaucer is ridiculous, but also universities are the opposite of places where people are experiencing racism in an institutionalized way. It's not as if racism doesn't happen; it happens all sorts of, but in fact, there are places where the opposite's happening. So maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I mean, this is what is so remarkable is the effort that goes into maintaining this narrative that on campuses, one is the subject of rampant bigotry. I was just protested at Holy Cross, and that chant was hilarious. My oppression is not a delusion. This got chanted again and again to drown me out. And afterwards, this is organized by the Black Student Union at Holy Cross, which is a Catholic Jesuit school up in Worcester, Massachusetts. The co-president of the union said, "I'm just so proud of what we did. We're on to bigger. I can tell this is the start of something new." For you to be claiming that there was something courageous and effective and transcendent about chanting "my oppression is not a delusion" at Holy Cross or any other college is ridiculous.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, again, because of the academic skills gap, which is very large, it's a standard deviation, that if schools are determined to engineer their critical mass of minority students, it's very complicated because you get a cascading effect. They are all admitting so-called underrepresented minorities, URMs in the admissions jargon, with a huge deficiency of skills. No, I am not saying, and nobody, this is something called mismatch, which you're bringing students in to an academic environment for which they are not competitively qualified. Nobody is saying that minority students should not go to college. What they're saying is they should go to college under the same conditions as everybody else, which is in a class where your peers share your academic qualifications. Only blacks and Hispanics are put under the burden of being catapulted into academic environments where they are not prepared to compete.
We're not all of them. I mean, it's obviously some of them.
Some, but it's pretty big. I mean, Harvard in this recent law school, the admissions case,
With the Asians.
Harvard's, yeah. If Harvard did not exercise large racial preferences, it's currently at 14% black student body. It would be less than 1%. So there's a lot of preference going on. Anyway, so for students to think that they're the victims of racism, it's just the opposite. They want, and the same goes for faculty. Again, the faculty, there's not a single academic department that is not twisting itself into knots to hire and promote not just URMs, black and Hispanic faculty, but women as well.
Well, yeah, we'll get
Right,
there.
we'll get to that.
You know, the important thing is I want you to provide what I find one of the many things I find refreshing about your writing is that you actually provide statistics and data and not opinion about this, and the statistics are quite remarkable in a variety of cases, and I'll try and quote some of them from you. But one of the things that you talk about when you're talking about the fact that universities, you constantly focus, they should be focusing on in your case, great books and education, but instead are focusing on what is an quote unquote an invented environment of oppression,
Yeah.
and people feel so threatened that they want to close down anything that appears to threaten them, any speech that appears to threaten them, which is really, if anything, universities should be the bastions of free speech. They should be the place where you hear things, and I've said, and in fact, I was planning to say later, but I'll say it now, that I've always said that one of the purposes of education is to make you uncomfortable, in the sense that if you're comfortable, you're really not pushing your boundaries. And what's the point of going to school if you're not pushing your boundaries? But
yeah, I actually disagree with that. I mean, that's said a lot. And I guess it's becoming an increasingly conservative view of education. To me, the best definition of it comes from the British philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who said that school is about passing on an inheritance.
Yeah, okay. Well, hold that thought, because I know the last part of your book is the purpose of universities, and I think that's one place where we disagree somewhat. I think partly because of your background in, let me just say it now, your background in literature,
Yeah, sure.
where great books are important. And the remarkable thing about physics is, for example, is that if you're really good, you don't ever have to read a book at all. Feynman could derive everything himself rather than reading books. And I love books, so let's make that clear. So I want to get to that academic discussion, but I want to get there going through the materials you talk about first. And one of the things that I found striking when you talked about shutting you down and other people and potentially racist speech, or the assumption that everything that's happening is racist, you quoted Frederick Douglass, who himself said slavery cannot tolerate free speech.
Yeah.
And he warned that liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It's the right which they first of all strike down. And so the irony, in some sense, of striking down speech in an effort to preserve liberty is a remarkable thing to be happening in.
Right. Well, they wouldn't. I don't know. And I think conservatives way overuse liberty and freedom. I'm so sick of it because there's many more things.
Yeah, I
that
grew
are
up in
important.
Canada where we didn't talk about liberty and freedom as much as Americans do.
I see. So maybe, and was it that much less free? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it didn't strike me as that.
I'm sure not.
That's colored me.
No, I think tradition and order is also very important. But in any case, they're not striking it down in the name of liberty. They're striking it down in the name of their power and their effort to crush perceived oppression. But what I find really amazing is the failure of universities to teach these students to be able to think abstractly and to extrapolate from a current situation to derive a principle for that. Because every time they are claiming that they have the force majeure to shut these people down, they're setting a precedent saying that is something legitimate to do. It's not that difficult. You don't have to engage in very abstract logic to say, okay, so what happens if we give Trump this power? Yeah. Do you really want Trump to be able to define what hate speech is? Because I'm sure he's willing to do so. Yeah. And I'm sure there's plenty of media outlets that he would call hate speech. So that's one thing at the very least, whether or not you believe in the free marketplace of ideas, if you're at all conscious of the tables can turn. Now, it may be that in academia, it is an empirically sound judgment that the tables will never turn. And forever, here on out, we will always be in control and we will be the ones defining hate speech. But should there be some kind of apocalypse and power changes, again, the historical ignorance of this, because this is what governments have done throughout history.
Exactly. It's you'd think that the lessons of history would be learned.
Right, but they don't learn history. I mean, come on, they're not reading history.
Yeah,
So.
I've quoted this before, but I learned it last year. I love this quote from Mark Twain. He said, "History may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot." And but one of the problems is not just the ignorance of, literally the ignorance of students who are feeling this, but the fact that university administrations are going along with it. And an example, I guess, that hits both of us because we're both at Yale is this remarkable experience. I want to read from your book here. People have probably heard of this, but a notorious video of a black female student at Yale screaming and cursing at her college master in November 2015. And before I left Yale, I was going to become a college master, so that even gets more. Anyway, wow. It's a chilling portrait of self-engrossed, bathos-filled entitlement that's never been corrected by truth, much less restrained by manners. "Be quiet," she shrieks at the frozen administrator. "Why the fuck did you accept the master position? Who the fuck hired you?" She continues at full self-righteous cry. "You should not sleep at night. You're disgusting." What caused this? The master's wife, child psychologist Erica Christakis, had recently suggested in an email that the Yale multiculturalism bureaucracy did not need to oversee Halloween costumes. Her email prompted an open letter signed by nearly 1,000 faculty, deans, and students accusing her of racism and white supremacy and calling for her and her husband's immediate removal from their jobs and campus home. 100 or so, mostly minority students, then mobbed her husband, Nicholas Christakis, a renowned physician and sociologist, for an hour-long abuse session in the college quad that included "Be quiet," shrieked among equally horrified displays of rudeness. "You are disgusting," screamed another student. "I want your job to be taken from you. Look at my face, first of all, and understand that you are such a disappointment to this university, to your students, to yourself. You are disgusting male. You were disgusting 20 seconds ago, a day ago, and a month ago." And then Christakis later hugs one of the students, Abdul Razak Mohammed Zakaria, in a conciliatory gesture. But Zakaria orders Christakis to understand that, quote, "the situation right now doesn't require you to smile." Another female student, Alexandra Zina Barlow, cries that Christakis' invocation of free speech creates, quote, "a space to allow for violence to happen on this campus." Christakis responds, "That I disagree with." Barlow shouts at him, "It doesn't matter whether you agree or not. It's not a debate." Now, the reason I wanted to do all that and mention those two names is, as you mentioned later, in case anyone misunderstood where the administration's sympathies at Yale lay, Yale conferred on Alexandra Zina Barlow and Abdul Razak Mohammed Zakaria its graduation prize for accomplishment in, quote, "the service of race and ethnic relations." Yale lauded Barlow for her, quote, womanist, feminist, anti-racist work, and for teaching her peers, faculty, and administration about inclusive leadership. I just, what can one say?
What can one say? I mean, again, it's hard to believe that there's any faculty member, no matter how nuttily committed to the victimology narrative, that would not be appalled by this.
But but you point out over and over again. Well, in this case, faculty signed this letter, but they often, in the case of your case too, I think, the faculty did not stand up.
No.
And one can understand that as a faculty member, former faculty member. There's lots of fear that if you do stand up, and somehow, I mean, faculty live in fear. You may not realize that, but they live in fear of people taking away their resources and their department shrinking, and they live subject to the whims of the administration in some sense. And although they may perhaps shouldn't be so timid, it's really, one can at least understand how speaking out against a political wave,
yes,
which is adopted by administrators, would be viewed as something dangerous for a faculty member to do for their own career.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah.
It's it may not be laudable, but it's understandable.
No, it's very understandable. It's easy for me to take my pot shots and get out, So it would take a heck of a lot of courage to be a pariah in an environment where you have to live every single day.
But yeah, no, it was amazing. Again, the experience my wife had, there were all these faculty standing in the back of the room when these students were stopping the speaker from speaking in a law class and the students from hearing it, and not a single person said anything. But it's, peer pressure is very, and it's very hard to overcome virtue signaling, which we'll really, I think, want to talk about at some time or not.
Well, but the faculty are not just scared of the administrators; they're also scared of the students. I recently was reading this wonderful 1917 lecture that Max Weber, the great German sociologist, gave, called "Science is a Vocation."
Yeah.
Because I gave a speech about social justice, and he says another reason why an academic should not indulge in his own political views on the academic platform is because his audience is forced to be silent, meaning the students are not allowed to talk back. They have to accept his authority. And I thought, if only. I mean, this is just such a grotesque inversion of what I think should be the proper hierarchy.
Well, you see, actually, I think it's interesting. I think students should be encouraged to be skeptical of their professors, and that's part of education. I mean, I've always viewed authority as an anathema in some sense, or at least to be questioned. In fact, one of the things, a total aside, but I like to bring in science, is that I was a chair of a department for many years and involved in admission committees, and of course one saw a lot of Chinese students coming in physics because they certainly do much better on exams than American students, and their GRE scores overwhelm American students on the whole. But the interesting thing was that when they came into graduate school, they do well on the classes, but when it came to dissertation time,
really,
what was happening was that they unduly respected the professors. They would never want to contradict. And what's wonderful, I think, at least for China, that's beginning to happen is you're beginning to see that change. Mm-hmm. There's still too much hierarchy in China, and because if you don't, at least in science, and I hope it's the case in the humanities as well, if you're not willing to contradict the wisdom of those before you, then you're not likely, at least, to explore new options. And in physics, if you're not willing to say, well, maybe this is wrong, and let me explore it and see, and let the data tell you whether it is or not, then so you have to not accept if you quote unquote the wisdom of your professors. You should be willing to listen to it, but I tend to think that. And again, this is where maybe we slightly disagree. I think I should listen to everything with a skeptical mind, including, if I'm a student, what the professor in front of me is saying.
Well, I was a talky student. I loved talking in class. These days, I do sort of feel like students are better seen and not heard. But I would say it's different. I mean, science is clearly teleological, and you are definitely, like Weber said, as a scientist, you know that whatever you do is going to be canceled. That's your hope.
Well, you hope you're wrong. It won't be canceled, and that's important. That's another.
But it may be transcended.
It'd be transcended. That's the biggest
and
misunderstanding of
incorporated.
science. Yeah,
Right.
Newton is still right. He's not canceled.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And that's but I say that only because that's a huge misunderstanding on the part that somehow scientific revolutions do away with what was before them. They don't at all. They just incorporate it in a new whole. Neither do political revolutions ever do away, in my opinion, with everything that went before them ultimately.
You can't. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know whether China did or not.
Yeah, maybe.
But I would say in the humanities, I think that's not quite right. I think that there is no student knows enough to challenge his professor's theory of how early civilization spread around the Mediterranean. I'm sorry, a freshman coming in does not know that.
Well, no, okay, but I think...
And you don't challenge the periodic table, you don't challenge German case
endings. You can
endings.
ask questions about it. And look, and I think you should be willing to challenge it and then find out you're wrong. I mean, if a student says, that doesn't sound logical to me, then it's worthwhile saying it and then finding out that their thinking is wrong. Because actually, this is fun because I hadn't planned to go into any of this, but pedagogically, there's a lot of data, in my opinion, that suggests the only way you learn something is confronting your own misconceptions. When you learn something by writing it down the blackboard, well, you can memorize it, but you forget it. But when you see something and you say, gee, and then you think about it and you work on it and you realize, hold on, what I thought I was thinking was just completely wrong, then you remember it, then you internalize it. And that happens in physics all the time.
And again, I think we are up against the two cultures problem.
Well,
I don't think a student approaching Aeschylus's Oresteia for the first time, one of the great works of Western civilization, this trilogy about the house of Atreus that traces the creation of justice and the rule of law from a cycle of the Furies, Orestes being pursued by the Furies to take vengeance on his mother for killing his father, and being persuaded by Athena to accept the rule of the tribunal. A student approaching that as a freshman would do that simply it's not for him. I don't even know what it would mean to disagree with this. You're there to absorb something that is a novel experience.
I guess the point is I don't think anyone should ever be dissuaded from disagreeing. They just can be wrong. And so I'd like to encourage students to at least, in a reasoned, rational way with substance. That's the whole point, is to have rational discussion, is to be able to back up your points, your arguments with rational points. But not to be afraid to say, I just don't, either maybe I don't understand it or I disagree. I think we have to encourage that. And you reference, in fact, someone I know, a friend of mine, Jonathan Haidt, and co-wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And I heard him here actually at the 92nd Street Y in New York a while ago. I happened to be in town. And they make an interesting point. But you also, but I took your take on it, which again caused me to rethink this. So there's an example. They make it a point that students feel entitled because they grew up in a society where, and not only feel entitled, but they feel easily offended and feel they should never be offended because they grow up in a society where parents teach them that everything's a threat, that going across the street alone is a threat, and the world is threatening, and you should never ever feel uncomfortable. That modern American parents want their children to never feel uncomfortable. And when they do feel uncomfortable, they feel that's an offense, even a physical offense, even if the words are making them uncomfortable. And I think the point is very well made. But you pointed out an interesting point that when it comes to trigger words that are gender-related, you point out that if that coddling was the case, you say, if risk-averse child-rearing is the source of the problem, why aren't heterosexual white male students demanding safe spaces, as we talk about safe spaces? Because there are safe spaces. I heard recently, and I don't know the university, where a speaker was coming in to speak about free speech. And at the time, there were women's groups on campus that organized safe spaces so people would not have to hear about free speech. And you do make the point that safe spaces now are, if it's just coddling, that alone can't explain things because there appears to be a gender gap in the need for safe spaces. Do you want to talk about it?
And but we were just sharing before this show started. a really nauseating document from the secretary of Yale University about these spa treatments that undergraduates can get because they just need to unwind from their stressful days being a Yale student. Come on, you've got like a sampling of extra virgin olive oil in the dining rooms. It's outrageous that this amount, it's decadent that they're being taught to think of themselves as in need of therapy as an 18-year-old. They should be out like striding the moors and wanting to write romantic poetry, for God's sakes. They are the most unfortunate individuals in human history. So there is, and I also see, in New York, you see these little 3-foot-tall 4-year-old boys on tricycle scooters. So this is probably the most stable contraption ever invented. So 2 big wheels, and the boy's 3 foot, and he's wearing this huge bubble helmet, and his father's got his hand on the shoulder just to steady him even further. So there's definitely that. And, I contrast this with H.L. Mencken's fabulous autobiography, Happy Days of Growing Up in Baltimore in the 19th century, and just raising hell. I mean, that's what boyhood should be. So there is
And
that.
girlhood.
But I think that I do disagree with Hayton Lukianoff in that I think this whole guise of being vulnerable, as we started speaking with briefly in the start of our talk, is ideological. It is very specifically targeted at a certain set of ideas. It's based on hatred and resentment. And it's not, everybody who comes out of this environment is not given an equal hand to play in the victim sweepstakes.
Well, and once again, playing the victim card and having that victimhood validated are two sides of the coin. They're both, you would argue, equally, or at least both of concern. And we've already pointed out this ridiculous response of Yale, which doesn't surprise me, actually, having taught there for a long time. But